Hey guys, Gavin Seim here. I thought we'd take a look at this new JPEG to RAW AI from Topaz software. I did an article this week and I was talking about a sunset that I shot and how I did it accidentally in JPEG and the process I went through to maintain the quality and get the image I wanted. And one of the readers sent me a message and he said, well, all you had to do is use JPEG to RAW AI. And I kind of chuckled and I said, no, you don't get a RAW file from a JPEG. That's not how it works. But nonetheless, I went and checked out this new release because I haven't looked at it yet. And I thought, well, let's download a trial. Topaz is claiming that it's using machine learning. That's a word that gets thrown around a lot today, and that it will improve the dynamic range and the artifacts and the color space and essentially take that JPEG file and give it a lot of the power of a RAW file. So let's go download a trial and see if we can actually get a RAW file from a JPEG.
Topaz has made some really neat stuff in the past. I don't actively use a lot of Topaz stuff right now. I think technically I'm still an affiliate of Topaz. Full disclosure, I don't really promote that anymore, but I think somewhere back in the annals of our blogging archives when we used to review Topaz stuff. But today I'm just looking at this casually just to see, all right? And I've got an image. Here's a dark image from this sequence. This is the one I actually came out with in the end after very carefully editing and working with it. But I've taken one of the ones I exposed pretty dark. Now, I want to talk about RAW versus JPEG. RAW keeps all the information, JPEG doesn't. We know that. With a JPEG file, see all this black here, right? The sky looks really pretty, but there's so much black, it's just blacking out. Here's the problem. There's still no detail here. Even if I were to crank the exposure up to 5 here, and of course that makes everything else suck, but there's still, it's just falling apart because there's no information captured here. So I can crank my exposure and combine that with shadow. Notice how when I do shadow, it's lightening up the shadows, except for it's not affecting this. And that's because it's so black that there's really no information to recover. Okay, so this is truly a JPEG with lost information here. Even if I crank everything up, even if I use highlights, I'm still got a lot of black clipping. Now, if this was a RAW file, I might get some noise still, but I would be pulling information because there would be a lot more depth of information in this file. So I thought, well, okay, here's one that is an example that I can't really recover that black on an image this dark. JPEG to RAW AI. Okay, now the first thing, we're failing from the start here. It looks like I actually have to set up an account to even use the trial. For the sake of you guys, I'm gonna go ahead and do this, but not cool, Topaz. I mean, if you're gonna have a trial, you let people use a trial. You don't not make people sign up for an account and give their information and join your mailing list and stuff, telling you that they're gonna use your personal information. They say they don't sell your information. I guess that's good. All this stuff, right? Just to get a trial. And nope. Even the trial will not work with the brand new account there. So after about 10 minutes of screwing around, and I have no idea why their systems wouldn't work, changing my password, all that kind of stuff, I finally was able to activate a trial. But we're going to take an honest look here because Topaz does have some really smart developers. But let's go ahead and start the process. Let's convert this, as Topaz says, to a DNG. Now, I can say in advance, you can't replace shooting RAW. You cannot make a JPEG a RAW. Even if you have a smart machine that fixes problems, and uses machine learning or whatever all these things mean, right? We like to throw these words around in marketing, but the fact is, even if you had a supercomputer, it can't determine what was actually there, right? It could guess and maybe make a good image, and that might be cool, although I don't think we're really there yet technology-wise. And so where a JPEG file might be 15, 20 megs, a RAW file is going to be 60, 80, 100 megs, okay? But here we go. So here's the JPEG file we started with, and here is this DNG edit. Now this is interesting. It's actually made the file a little flatter. Let's start cranking it up. And guess what? Nothing has really changed, okay? The blacks are still absolutely black and absolutely clipped. And if I even crank up the exposure, now bear in mind when I do this, I couldn't actually crank up the exposure this high. I would have to use a mask or something. I don't want a lot of detail here on the left. If we look at the finished image I made over here that actually worked out, where's my final right here, you can see I didn't bring a lot of detail. I just wanted a little bit of texture. I didn't want that to go completely black, all right? So if we look at our DNG conversion, what's happening here is I'm just testing to see how much we can crank it up. And even cranking up the image all the way, trying to boost it here. Again, I'm just going for this patch on the left to see what we can do and not worrying about what's over here on the right for now, just for point of reference. Let's go ahead and copy all the settings. And let's paste the same settings to our JPEG, exactly the same. Okay, now let's look. It's actually worse. And I just want you guys to look at this. See this? We're getting, again, these are the same settings, right? I'm just trying to push up this to see what's in there. Here I have a lot of noise, but here it's markedly worse. I have all this purple banded artifacts, okay? And so you can see there's more color pollution, there's crazier stuff going on. Here, I can actually do a little bit of restoration here, right? And still try to kind of bring this up. I could bring a gradient in from the side, for example, to try and save this a little bit and just run exposure on the gradient here. And then turn it down in the other areas. Try to keep my color here. And then I could start doing noise reduction, things like that, to sort of kind of save this file. Now, if this had been raw, different story. But wow, it's just a mess. I can't fix this with noise reduction. There's nothing I can do here. Go back to our native states. You can see how it made it a little flatter. And at glance, it looks like, okay, we put a little more dynamic range in. And let's go 2 stops, okay? If we do a 2-stop increase on this and we compare the two, let's see if something a little more moderate, how it looks. 2-stop increase. On the right, we have the DNG version. It's gone through Topaz. Okay, right here is our DNG. And right here's our JPEG. Even with just a 2-stop exposure, I'm looking here, it's actually, again, it's worse. Okay, look at the size of the artifacts. Whereas in here, we just have some noise, which is kind of what you get if you have a dark image and you start pushing the exposure. Over here, we have these weird white blips and artifacts all over this image. Look at the difference. It's actually far worse, even with a more moderate exposure increase. So not looking good so far for the AI of Topaz. The other photo we were working with was very dark. We were trying to recover shadows. This one is very light. It's sunset in the meadow here in this shoot. And this is one, rather than only having a JPEG, I actually do have a RAW and a JPEG. So this is the JPEG, as you see here. And these are straight out of camera, okay? Here is the raw file. Now, as you can see, the raw file is much less processed by default. The color is a little bit different, things like that. But there's more information here in the raw file. And if we actually go in, you'll see where our big problem is. I mean, there's a lot of high key feel here, but really right in here. Oftentimes when I get this much clipping, I have to kind of manually paint in some detail and things like that. And even in this raw file, I can pull back. You can see I can recover a lot. I just dial back highlights to 100. Let's take a brush. And I'm going to use the brush right on the hair here. Let's focus on the hair since that's an important highlight area. And I'm going to do more highlight recovery and exposure on the hair here. Now you can see that I'm going to have to continue doing some work if I want to save this, but I was able to restore a lot of detail into these highlights from the raw file. Let's actually copy everything verbatim. And let's take those same settings we just did over to the JPEG. And you can see what's happening. This is why I use RAW. You can see it's really not recovering anything. It's so clipped there that it really is simply darkening it, but when you darken something that's white, it essentially just turns gray. You can immediately see which one's RAW and which one's JPEG, right? No question. You don't even have to look at the file names. This one here is not recovering, and this RAW file is recovering quite a bit. There's quite a bit of detail being brought back into it. Okay, taking 1984 JPEG and it's converting it to a RAW. It's definitely doing some stuff here. I mean, I feel like there's a lot of noise reduction and stuff going on in this, and it takes a while to process, but let's see what we get compared to the original RAW. You can't make a true RAW from a JPEG, but I don't want to be too negative. You can, theoretically, we can make technology that improves it. Okay, so I made a little quick collection with all 3 of these in it now, so we can be nice and tidy. All right, here is our original RAW to camera. Here is our JPEG. All right, and here is our Topaz. So first of all, let's just try pasting the same settings that we used on the other ones. So now all of these photos have exactly the same settings. So as you can see, again, Topaz is kind of removing some of the color cast and neutralizing the tone. It's kind of giving it that raw sort of flatness, which isn't necessarily a bad thing. It gives you something to work with. It's flattening the tone profile so that perhaps theoretically you have more to go with. That's kind of interesting. On the left, we have the Topaz DNG. On the right, the JPEG file that we've done a little bit of brushing on, and that same brushing has also been copied over to the Topaz DNG. So first of all, let's see if we're getting any more dynamic range. And the answer is no. There is absolutely not more dynamic range thus far coming out of this. And bear in mind, on the left here, we have the same. Let's actually review what we've done. You can see that we're just losing it in the highlights on both. The DNG might be a little worse, but honestly, I think we're just seeing the fact that it's flattened out the color profile a little bit. If you look in the details, though, you see what's happening here. See the artifacts? What's happening is whatever it's doing is compounding. So we have a little bit of banding right here on the JPEG. In the same file on the DNG, we're actually increasing those artifacts around this plant. You see we have a little bit of a rainbow effect here. Remember on the other one we had that purpling going on? Okay, so what's happening is, and this is not surprising, the more you process an image, especially a JPEG, and this is one of the important things, even if you're not dealing with an extreme situation where you have a lot of dynamic range, one of the reasons we work from RAW is because you can do your initial process on that source file, because the more generations you make of a file, the more you process a file into different files, the more you start to lose. Now there has been some noise reduction here. You can look down in some of these areas and kind of see that it almost does look a tiny bit smoother in some areas on the Topaz. Down here next to this flower right here, see this? And then if you look over here, it looks like it's been noise processed just a little bit. And that seems to be a lot of what this software is doing, is noise reduction. Okay, but again, let's go back and compare. The goal was to compare the raw file, which is right here, to the Topaz. So let's put those next to each other now. Here's the DNG from Topaz, and here's our original raw. And again, we are -100, and I'm just going to kind of tweak. Let's do a little curve process and a little clarity. Let me process this roughly like I would actually process it, okay? So change a few settings, dial back here and there, try and bring back some highlights, lift my shadows a little bit, give myself a little bit of contrast, dial back the clarity a little bit, let's leave the dehaze alone, vibrance up a touch, okay? And still needs some work, but all right, here's my raw file, and you can see that I've pushed this hair almost as far as I can. I probably need to do a little pixel painting in Photoshop and just kind of paint some golden over that. That's something for another day. Let's shift, Control C. I'm gonna copy everything, okay, and then we're gonna go over to the raw file from Topaz, and I'm gonna paste everything verbatim. On the left here is the Topaz DNG, and on the right's the original raw. And we're just looking here. Now I want you to see what happens, and this is another JPEG thing. You can see subtlety. There's actually more detail in the hair. See how it kind of looks over sharpened right here? Because again, you're coming from the JPEG, so the JPEG has thrown out most of your information. It's processed it the way the camera thinks it should be, and then Topaz is using its AI to try and determine more. So you actually have a lot more plasticky fakiness here. If you look at the hair of this one, this raw file still needs a little more work, but things are natural. There's an organic feel to this, whereas this one just looks overworked, okay? The artifacts are kind of random a little bit more on the Topaz. So you can see we have a little bit of banding, kind of light artifacting from the sun coming at the sensor here on the raw file. And some of that is improved, but it's kind of random on the JPEG. So it's almost like some of it is actually worse and some of it's smoothed over. And the dynamic range is simply not recovering. You can see in here on the hair, we're actually bringing back a lot of detail. The reality is, guys, that this is not a raw file. It will never be a raw file. You're taking a JPEG, it's thrown away all that raw information, and nothing we can do with current technology, at least, is going to fix that. I'm not saying don't use Topaz. I'm not saying they don't have some good software. They have some pretty neat stuff that they make, but I think they're over marketing this one, and I think this is a problem today is we kind of market sensationalism and magic. And the reality is what you get in camera is the magic. Shoot raw when you can in a situation where you need to edit. If it's journalism or if it's something, you know, where you need a lot of shots, if you don't need to edit, if you don't need to worry about the high dynamic range, sure, there's times for JPEG. But don't ever expect a JPEG to be a raw. I think there's one more image we should look at, and that's a mobile image. You know what? Here's a scene down along the coast of Mexico. Really neat sunset, birds, the whole works. This is straight out of camera. The problem we have with these teeny tiny sensors is, especially in low light, you really do start to see artifacts and a loss of detail. It's a given that you don't have a lot of dynamic range, but this image isn't actually bad. I mean, it's a good looking image, but I wouldn't print this. I wouldn't consider this an art print. It's a beautiful scene that I kind of wish I had taken with a better camera, honestly, but you see that there's a lot of pastiness, right? You don't have the vivid detail in the waves. Okay, so I'm opening up 8914 JPEG. All right, on this one, let's turn on noise and blur reduction to high and just see what happens. And we'll save it to the source folder. All right, let's make that DNG. So now this is an iPhone 10 file. Here's our new file. And I'm gonna bring that into Lightroom. Okay, here's our original JPEG out of camera. And here is our Topaz. The only edits that have been done thus far are the crop. I'm gonna copy that crop. So we have exactly the same image between the two of these. On the left, we have the Topaz RAW. The first thing I see here is a lot of noise reduction has been done. It did do a pretty good job cleaning up these artifacts, but as is commonly the problem with noise reduction, this feels less like an AI to me and more just like noise reduction. Let's come in 2:1. Now you can see here what's happened is there's really not more detail, right? And remember, I put it kind of in high mode to really reduce noise and artifacts because this is a mobile image. There's quite a bit. To be fair, it's done pretty good here, but this is certainly not a raw file. If you notice the boat here, right? Here's the Chavalita, and we have quite a few artifacts in the original iPhone image, and the artifacts are less in this one, but at the same time, some of them were ignored. So now we kind of have these blotchy artifacts going on. You notice down here on the boat, it's been smoothed. So when you do a lot of noise reduction, you do lose detail. And what happens when you have an image with a lot of artifacts is it tends to get rid of some of them and not all. Is it an improvement? Yeah, I think so. I think it's an improvement about the equivalent of just doing a decent noise reduction. Topaz claims that it's given us more improved color space, improved dynamic range. So here we're looking at the artifacts first. Detail, I wouldn't say is improved. If anything, I would say there's a slight loss of detail. Look down here around the edge of the boat. You can see that there's a little bit of color pollution here where the noise was done. But I have to be fair. There's a fairly decent noise reduction done on this image that at a glance, right? If we're not zooming in super far, it does look pretty good, right? So if I was posting this on Facebook or Instagram or something, okay, so this is the original JPEG out of camera, out of the iPhone 10. Let's kind of punch down our highlights, bring up our shadows a little bit of clarity, right? Vibrance. Let's just kind of make this a little more punchy. We can see here on our original JPEG as we do this, because a JPEG from a phone has even less range than a JPEG from a professional camera. And so you can see as we increase those shadows, we'll look at all these artifacts that come in. If we were on a raw file doing a shadow increase on an image like this, we'll be bringing in detail on the rocks down here, right? Because it'd be a raw image. We can see what's happening here is that from a distance, it is boosting it, okay? But it's a JPEG, and so when you get in close, you'll see as you punch those shadows, it's not these kids' heads, for example, it's not bringing detail into that. This is where in a raw file, exposed in the same way as this, you would absolutely see an improvement. But let's take what we've done here. Again, let's copy everything. Let's hit the C tool and compare. And again, on the left is our DNG, and on the right is our JPEG. All right, so let's zoom in. Let's look at the motor here. Okay, now Topaz cleaned it up a little bit. So I think to be fair, Topaz did do a fairly good job of the noise and artifact removal on this one. It's a slight improvement, okay? Bear in mind, this one on the right, our JPEG, we haven't even done Lightroom or or Photoshop. We haven't even done regular noise reduction. What you will see though is this has not in any way made this a raw file, okay? It's still black down here. It's still non-recoverable. There's no way, there's no AI that's looking and saying, oh, I think there should be detail in the back of those kids' heads, right? And let's put hair there. That would be a true AI, and there's nothing that exists like that. Is there some AI tech analyzing this image? Maybe. Is it doing something? Yes, it's doing something. So maybe we could say that on phone images, this has some use. Frankly, I think Topaz's noise reduction or neat image or even Photoshop's native noise reduction would give us a similar result, but I don't want to make this too long. The bottom line is here that this is an interesting piece of software. It is helping with the artifacts. You can see here on the wave on the water, it's definitely cleaned up some of that. And so as we recover shadows on these, it is lightening them up. But see how it's kind of gray and muddy? If you have a raw file, it brings out texture and detail in the surface of the water. If I had a true raw file here, I could do 60, 70, 80 shadow recovery, and I would still be bringing detail out of those shadows, right? I could do exposure recovery and I would bring detail out of those. Same with my highlights, right? See how these highlights are kind of clipped? And if I try to recover those, there's nothing to recover because those highlights were clipped in the original JPEG, which threw out that information. So while we're making them more gray so that they don't officially go into clipping, we're not actually bringing back detail. Detail means texture. Detail gives us something to work with. So interesting what they're trying to do here. I think it's fascinating, but it's not a raw file. It's not even close to a raw file. All right, that's a look at Topaz JPEG to RAW. It's fascinating. It's a bold endeavor, but at this point, anyhow, there's no replacing shooting a real raw file. If you want dynamic range, if you want editing flexibility, guys, shoot raw, shoot raw, shoot raw. No software is going to give that to you after the fact. Get it right in camera, and you'll have it beautiful in post. All right, guys, have a good one. Hope this was useful to you.